Of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, NHS consultant and surgeon Ranjeet Brar, you're most welcome. What consequences could this policy of so-named wealthy countries hiring medical staff from African nations, what is it going to have in the long term?
It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me. This is not a new policy. We've seen it for a long time. I've been in the NHS for over 20 years. When I first was a medical student and young doctor, we used to see very many nurses and doctors come from the Philippines, later from India, and now also from Africa. So it's been a prolonged campaign to target and recruit from abroad. It has a few effects, but really they can't be distinguished from the overall effect of the fact that we have a divide in our world between a few very wealthy nations and the vast, massive nations who have formerly been the colonies of those nations. And while we don't have that direct system of colonialism, I think the reference made by leaders of Africa's nurses are essentially right, because we have a neocolonialism based on an economic divide. And that, of course, leads to an ongoing brain drain, not just in the medical field, but across the spectrum of skilled labor, people who are vital to the building of all aspects of the economy, from the so-called third world, from the neocolonized world, from the global majority, to the imperialist heartlands. And they do it for money, because money, of course, in the current world, in the current economic order, decides all things. So you can understand the motivation of the skilled laborers in coming, but they do leave their domestic countries struggling to provide. If we have 9 nurses per 1,000 of the population in the West African nations that were particularly highlighted, Senegal, the Gambia, they have 1/10 of that number. And it's their most skilled nurses who come. And they're fantastic colleagues. I can tell you that the nurses who come from abroad are fantastic colleagues. They're vital to the running of the NHS. But it does
appear to be a sticking plaster, doesn't it? Because when you've got Western countries choosing to hire medical personnel from nations with lower healthcare standards, they're doing so at the expense of perhaps developing their own healthcare system long term.
They do, and that's another effect of having a global market. It's the same reason, why doesn't Britain grow all of its own food domestically? It could happily has a domestic agriculture that could support 100 million people, but it doesn't, because it has a market system, and actually it lives. These first world nations like Britain live, like parasitically off the body of third world labor. So most of our wealth actually comes from abroad, comes from exploiting foreign labor. And so we have export of capital. We have this deindustrialization, de-skilling of our own labor force. And with that, though, there's a certain level of existence which is guaranteed to our workers. There is a downgrading of our education, of our housing, of our health resources, which is happening. And actually, what's currently we've seen with nurses domestically is they've had the removal of something called the bursary. They used to be funded to work. So you would work, your course would essentially be paid for, your board and living would be paid for while you train. So after 3 years, you'd come out a qualified nurse without debt. Now people are paying, like students, £9,000–10,000 a year, plus their accommodation, plus their training and course fees. They're coming saddled into actually quite a low-paid profession now, with huge amounts of debt. So fewer and fewer people are coming to nursing, and as a result, to meet this crisis of understaffing, the NHS is simply turning abroad, and as you say, leaching, really, is skilled and vital labour force from much of the third world.
Can I put perhaps an opposing view to you, though? On a personal level, surely if such migrants want to travel to other states to perhaps better their lives at the receiving country's request as well, that's their personal choice. What's so bad about giving them the opportunity?
Yeah, on a personal level, you can't criticise it. I would completely agree with you. But we have to ask, what is their choice based upon on a personal level? It's based upon the systematic impoverishment of their home countries. And it's that fundamental economic injustice, which was the basis of the primitive accumulation, of course, of the wealth of the first world countries. At the time Britain went to India, Britain was a poor country. India and China were rich countries. After 200 years of colonialism, Britain and the US and Europe have become rich countries, and those countries are poor countries. So it's a systematic looting, and I'm afraid it's that ongoing economic relation which has led to that being perpetually the case. And now by the debt trap, the IMF, the World Bank, all of the economic institutions, which actually are leading to the other stories that you're covering today. If you're talking about, and I've been listening to your coverage of the Palestinian genocide, of the war in Ukraine, these are the battles that our country in the US fights to maintain that economic injustice, which leads to the systematic impoverishment of much of the world. And then, of course, people will follow the money. They'll go away from the chaos, go away from the war, and follow a better life. So from an individual perspective, nothing wrong, but it is, the West, which is criminal in their economic system of causing this problem and compounding it by recruiting and taking away the skilled labour force of those countries.
We very much appreciate your time this Saturday. Thanks for coming on the programme. British NHS surgeon and British politician Ranjeet Brar.
Thank you.
Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić says his country is now facing enormous pressure over its position of